Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of ADAR Unveiled. I'm your host, Chrissy Hudson, and as always, I am joined by ADAR's executive leadership team, Dan Kelly, Doug Farrington, and Arie Bos. Here at ADAR, we firmly believe that being a good steward of the environment involves using our resources wisely. Now, we all know that there's a ton of waste generated in the food processing world, especially in the space of meat processing. But what if I told you that there's untapped potential within that waste? One man's trash is another man's treasure, as they say. So join us today as we embark on a journey to unravel untapped potential within the food processing waste world. Discover how ADAR is not only changing the game, but is leading the charge toward a future that's both sustainable and responsible. As always, we do have time reserved at the end of today's conversation for questions and answers. If we don't get to your question, please drop those in the comments below, and our team will start answering those questions as soon as we wrap up here. All right, guys. Dan, Doug, and Arie, welcome. We are glad that you are here today.
Hi,
And
Chrissy.
Thank you.
let's kick off with a quick question regarding current disposal methods. So we've already established that food waste in general is very prevalent. I don't think there's a soul on this planet who doesn't already recognize that, right? But when it comes to food waste and specifically waste from the meat processing world, a lot of that waste is currently going into landfills. So let's talk to start with about how those current disposal methods are impacting the environment. Who wants to kick us off with that big discussion topic?
I can start, and then I'll have the team jump in. The general term is animal byproducts. People don't really think about that when they're buying meat from the store, but it's all the stuff that the producers, quite frankly, can't make any money on, or it's too hard to make money on, in short. And you can think of that as the bones, the blood, the guts, etc., versus just the meat. And so the animal byproducts literally today are, for the most part, depending on where you are in the world, thrown in the trash. They're thrown in the waste bin at the producers, and they're thrown in the landfill. And there's two problems with that. Number one, it creates an immense amount of methane or greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're talking about global warming, et cetera. People really underestimate the amount of methane that it releases. And so there's both impact in the transportation from the pickup at the producer to the landfill, but also once the actual underlying material is decomposing in the landfill itself, which is awful. This is a horrible smell, horrific smell, of course, but it reduces an incredible amount of methane. So that's number one, is the greenhouse gas emission. The second thing I think I would bring up is probably the soil and the water pollution. We've talked a little bit in these webinar series, and I know we're going to talk more in the future when we talk specifically about environmental waste and wastewater treatment, et cetera. But leachate, not a lot of people know what leachate is. And leachate is the nastiest of nasty sewage that goes down into the groundwater, and it poses environmental hazards to everything, to the entire supply chain, both the animal and human population. And so those are, I'd say, the two primary health issues that I can think of right now. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, Dan, now you mentioned this, all this disposal and in landfills. How costly is that to those processing companies? Do they have to pay permits, and what are the financial implications of that?
Yeah, they pay a thing called tipping fees, or the underlying fees that they pay the landfill to actually dump there. And those fees are getting more and more expensive every single year. And one of the reasons is, quite frankly, we're running out of space in the landfills, not just for animal byproducts, just for anything. And so it's a supply and demand problem at the moment. And we're looking for more and more ways, which is obviously why we're here as ADAR, to convert that waste, to eliminate it from even going in the landfill in the first place. So
I thought we were short on land and space here in the Netherlands, but even in the US, right?
US is a serious And specifically in creation of protein, the chicken waste area is, chickens are one of the fastest growing protein sources in the world as our population grows globally. And so that specifically is a huge problem in the United States at the moment. And I think it also over in Europe as well, Arie, right?
Yeah, I'll come to that a little bit later on this, but it absolutely is, and the European population is growing as the American population is, and the whole world is growing. So yes, you see an enormous increase of let's say low cost protein production.
Yeah, I mean, not only does the private sector, specifically the producers, are wanting to be more profitable, hence eliminating expense from putting it in the landfill, but quite frankly, this is a public municipality issue. This is a health issue that is in the bullseye for both local municipalities as well as even the EPA in the U.S. The federal level.
Yeah, I was just going to build on that as well from an environmental issue perspective, Dan. I didn't hear you mention the disease spread, right? Because this stuff is rotting. You get birds that are carrying this stuff around, and you have the threat of disease spreading from the rotting material in the landfill.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so we have growing population worldwide. So we know that as the population grows, we need more food to feed the growing population. But at the same time, that growing population also results in growing amounts of waste. So let's talk about kind of shifting that narrative a bit and the what if. Because at ADAR, we're kind of living in this really unique space, because the what if isn't what if anymore. It's right now and what's actually happening. So let's kind of switch gears and talk about some examples of how some of those specific byproducts can actually be upcycled and what their potential applications are. If they're not going to a landfill and they can be processed, whether that's with ADAR's technology or used in some form or fashion, what can those byproducts actually be used for in the real world instead of garbage?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. Yeah, and what we're really talking about here, primarily we're talking about cattle, pork, lamb, and poultry. Those are the primary sources of this byproduct, animal byproducts. And a lot of it, the byproduct is everything but the meat, right? So it could be bones, it could be intestines, organs, blood, guts, all that stuff we don't even really want to talk about, but that's essentially what it is. And with poultry, it's feathers as well, and feet and heads. So there's a whole host of different materials. And today, as Dan said, in the U.S., a lot of it goes into landfills or on farm fields. In Europe, I know there's incineration that happens, and they're burning it and actually creating some energy from the fats. So that is one thing, Chrissy, to answer your question. One of the uses could be as an energy production feedstock. Because there is a high fat content in much of this material, but also for a fertilizer, because the certain parts of these byproducts have high nitrogen content. And then from a feed perspective, you're talking about high protein, you're talking about calcium in the case of the bones. So there's a whole host of uses for this material. But if you just continue to take it to the landfill, but you dehydrated it first into a dry, odorless powder, which ADAR does, you're going to reduce your transportation and landfill tipping fees by 70 to 85% right there.
Wow, that's a pretty impressive number just from a cost perspective. Dan, Arie, did either of you all have anything you wanted to add?
I would just say
At the end of the day, even if you do that, like Doug says, bringing it to a landfill may still be a waste of value, even if it is not a very high value, but there may still be value in that material before you put it on a landfill, like using it for pyrolysis and create pure carbon out of it that you can sell. There are other ways to do that as well, I think, and here in Europe, landfill is something that is much, let's say, it's more and more difficult to do that. Putting animal byproducts or rendering products in a landfill is not allowed anyway. But I'll come back to those European situation later on.
Dan, did you have something else to share?
I was just going to share that the whole point here is that we create a solution before it needs to go to a landfill as well. But it's going to depend on the underlying producer and what they want to do with it. And so this is a fragmented industry that's largely decentralized. And so that's why specifically Doug was saying, you know, sometimes it might not make sense for the producer to make a new product out of it, but they just want to do it cheaper. That's fine, because that creates an economic benefit for everyone. Lowers impact in landfills, et cetera. Other producers will want to create a new value stream out of it. And so the bottom line is we're trying to take costs out of the supply chain, which should improve efficiency for all, including the price for protein at the grocery store.
Right, absolutely. So that kind of leads us into my next question. And you guys have sort of touched on this already, but let's talk about what are the environmental and economic, because we've been talking about that, benefits associated with repurposing animal byproducts. If we get them, you know, routed away from a landfill, what can we do with them? What are those benefits from an environmental and economic standpoint?
Yeah, I think we touched on quite a bit of it already. Economically, I mean, if you can turn those products that today are an expense to dispose of, you can turn those into a new revenue stream, I think, as Dan mentioned, whether it be feed, fertilizer, or as an energy production feedstock. Those are the primary ones. Already talked about using it for biochar and carbon creation. But also consider from a carbon intensity perspective, lowering your overall carbon intensity as an organization has a lot of value. And in addition, you know, the reduced transportation, the reduced methane emissions, you know, all of that's going to add up and potentially create carbon credits as another revenue source.
Let's remember the smell element too. Like we talked about hog manure last webinar series, I think, and you know, this is a nuisance problem, and private parties are suing private parties. Private parties, you know, residents are suing counties because they're not doing anything about it. So, I mean, it's so simple, and what I'm so proud that we can do is literally just eliminate the smell from any of the feedstock. That in and of itself, regardless of the economic benefits, is a huge pain point relief for both residents as well as local governments that are trying to eliminate smell from their communities.
Well, you see, if you look, I can't speak for the US situation, but if you look here in Europe, right, putting this material in landfills is basically not allowed. Of course, it happens, but it is against all of the European regulations. So there's the smell issue, there's the biohazard issue, there's the pollution issue, there's the contamination issue of soil and all these things, and specifically also the leachate with all the toxins and the NH3 in it. Now, so what happens in many cases, you see that the leftovers or the discarded parts, like Doug already mentioned, blood and sometimes skin or bones or others, these are crushed and they are made they are transformed into a kind of a bloody sludge, and that is transported to biogas installations to make energy. And then because of the nature of that material, it is very costly to transport it. You need special trucks, special tanks, and with all the safety issues with it, because it's basically biological contaminated material. Now, if you put it into a biogas installation after the anaerobic process, right, then the material that is left over from that is used as fertilizer. That was until 2020. Now, like we just discussed before in our manure webinar a month ago, right? The European Union has really taken a stance on environmental protection issues and measurements. Things are getting difficult, not to frustrate companies, but because the European continent is small with a lot of people, so we have to be very careful with the land and the future of the quality of the land. So also for this one, for this specific case, new regulations come in during the summer of this year. And these tell that anything that is being qualified as discarded or discharged material may no longer be transported without sanitizing it, and it may also not be used anymore as fertilizer. So this goes, I think, a little bit further than the regulations in the US right now. And you can think what you want, but this is what happens in Europe, and this will force companies to find other solutions to process these materials. Now, if you look at the repurposing of that material, technically speaking, right, we all think and feel that these are disgusting materials, but basically, if you boil down to it, its material is calcium, fats, proteins, right, and that's the technical view on these materials. Now, to repurpose it, you can only dry it, powderize it, or pulverize it, and make clean, sanitized powder of it before you can do anything else with it. And then it is perfectly suitable for incineration to create energy in a clean way, or to make a biochar, as Doug already mentioned, with pyrolysis. That is the logical future for these kinds of biological, let's say, contaminated materials. And after treating it in the right way, like deliquefying like we do, and sanitizing it with our ADS technology, then the material can be safely transported, and it can be changed or transformed in something that still remains or still has a value.
And that's like the total picture of being able to use 100% of the resources that we have available. Instead of throwing so much into a landfill or throwing so much to waste, we're actually able to utilize the full animal, if it's meat or what have you, just in a new and somewhat innovative way. So speaking of,
and you see, Chrissy, that this is where and nobody likes new regulation, right? Because they're always stringent and they're always tough and difficult. But it also stimulates innovation for companies to find new and better solutions for the future.
Absolutely. And speaking of that innovation, it's time we actually start talking about ADAR, because that's why we're here, right? So let's talk about, we've already kind of talked about the current situation and how these materials are being underutilized, okay, and what that potential is. So let's talk about how ADAR fits into that picture. How does our method of drying, pulverizing, and sanitizing material differ from those traditional disposal methods? And talk about how our ADS technology actually supports the concept of a circular economy.
Yeah,
that's a tough question.
Yeah, that's a lot of big questions.
All the tough questions go to Doug, as always.
Yeah. You handle that one, Doug.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
unpack that one for us.
We've kind of touched on it already too. I mean, rather than disposing in landfills, like even though that's even that is beneficial by using the ADAR technology, it can benefit even that. But rather than putting it in landfills, where it's causing those air and soil and water quality issues and potentially disease spread, by dehydrating it and creating an odorless dry powder, that's free of bacteria. You can do all that without heat and without fossil fuel usage, right? So the technology is well suited for processing this material into these feedstocks for either fertilizer, feed, or energy, all the things we've talked about.
Could I add just a couple of comments in there? I think there's three different ways that because I get so excited when we talk to really, really large customers here, and we've had so much interest and, quite frankly, very little publication by us related to the animal feed space. We've had really, really big customers reach out to us that are US and European that, quite frankly, are just interested in like one or all of these three different components. I'm just going to raise quickly. And it's not even regulation related. They're just trying to figure out how to be more profitable, save expenses too, right? Which is awesome. But like number one is the fact that we don't use heat, like specifically, like Doug said, other technologies right now are using heat, and heat kills nutrient value, period. And that's fine for certain waste products that you're simply just trying to throw away. Not good for the economic value of the output of the feedstock you're putting into the machine. So that's number one. We don't use heat. I'm specifically answering your question, Chrissy, how we're different, right? Number two, we don't use fossil fuels. So we don't use natural gas. We don't use diesel. We don't use unleaded. We use electricity and very little electricity, about 70 kilowatts an hour for 2 metric tons an hour. And the fact that we use electricity allows us to easily use renewable sources of electricity, something as simple as solar to something more advanced like hydrogen. And hydrogen companies have been reaching out to us because we make their upstream process of creating hydrogen more efficient on this type of waste material, which is awesome. So we don't use heat.
It's a good point for our next webinar then, by the way.
Good, yeah.
Good subject.
That's a good idea, yeah. So no heat, no fossil fuels, and the third is no chemicals. So for current technology today, or current waste disposal practices today, maybe is the best way of saying it, when they're sanitizing things, they're using chemicals, quite frankly, to eradicate the underlying pathogen, which is understood in certain situations where you have to do it. But the bottom line is we don't use chemicals. We use natural processes to create an organic matter on the backside. So there's no heat, there's no fossil fuel, and no chemical. And those three ways are how we describe specifically how we're different in the technology that's available today.
All right. So your answer kind of ties into my next question. So in talking about a circular economy, of course, that's the buzz phrase of the past few years, and making sure that all of the resources make that full path. So let's talk about circular economy principles related to animal byproducts specifically. How do those create new revenue streams for businesses?
Yeah, let me start and then I'll have the team jump in. Some we've already discussed, so I don't want to be a broken record here. Some is something as simple as fertilizers, right? From fertilizers to additives to pet foods, because we can sanitize, to any sort of bio-based material. But fertilizer to feed is how I describe it, just from an ag perspective, right? That's kind of the ag industry. The next is other industries that people don't think about. So specifically, the utilization of oils and proteins that are available in these animal byproducts, right? That once you actually break them down, you make the powder, but you retain the protein or the oil content. The cosmetics industry is a huge usage of oils in this space, as well as pharmaceutical industry. So all the drugs, et cetera. And we'll talk more about this in other webinars, such as using eggs and that sort of thing. But it all has the same concept as we can enable a resource recovery for something we're currently throwing away, and enable other industries across multiple industries. And then it's the energy space specifically. Like the energy production is what gets me most excited about creating a truly circular economy, not only on farm, but in local communities and for state and local governments, where you're literally converting these waste products that is a smelly, nasty material that's creating methane emissions, creating leachate problems. And we're literally creating an energy source to not only power homes, power vehicles, power buses, power industries. And that's really exciting for me personally. So I'll pause and I'll have the team take over.
Yeah, but then, you know, the energy space is a whole space on its own, right? It's a whole world on its own. But if you go back to the simple basics of what I just said, the materials, in the components of each materials, with the rendering material, with the leftover materials from animal processing. I mentioned calcium, fat, proteins, and there will some other stuff. But if you do the same thing with fruit pomace or pulps, right, which is fibers, vitamins, and for instance, if you do the same thing with seafood waste, and that is proteins, calcium. So you get dry powders of all these different materials. If you can mix them all up and you do it in a nice and a good way, right, then maybe you can create completely new products out of it, or food products for animals, right? And so we are not there yet, but the thinking, the change of thinking is very important, that we don't waste anything anymore. Anything. We should revalue, repurpose everything we can.
And I know in our larger team meetings as a group, not management team, but our larger team, extended teams across the world, we talk about creating a superfood quite a bit. And we have a lot of ambitions there. We're not willing to promise anything yet, especially because we're a conservative crew. But that goes along with your line of thinking, right, Arie?
Well, that is one of my fantasies, right? To be able to use everything we dispose of to repurpose it and to create, you call it superfood. I call it biological graded high quality food, right? Yeah. That is basically free because it was already disposed of, and we try to salvage that material.
All right, guys. We are out of time, so let's roll into a couple of questions. All right, let me switch screens. All right. Oh, here's a good one. Are there any specific nutrients in animal byproducts that are particularly beneficial for soil health and crop yield? Doug, Mr. Agriculture there, you want to take that question?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, thanks, Chrissy. It's a good question. You know, we've touched on it a little bit already. For an example, poultry feathers actually, believe it or not, have a lot of nitrogen in them. So, and nitrogen is very important for crop health and higher yields, right? So that one can't be ignored. But there's other materials that are also beneficial for crop production. You know, so you know, and then from a food perspective, obviously we've talked about calcium and other nutrients that and proteins that are very beneficial from that perspective as well.
All right. Okay, guys, we're going to wrap it up with this very large question that has a lot of implications. What role do policy changes play in promoting sustainable use of animal byproducts? You know, a second ago, we talked about some of the regulations, specifically the regulation changes in Europe, and there's differences between the EU and the US, and all of the regs that apply when it comes to animal byproducts, specifically for animal consumption or for human consumption. Even in the agriculture and fertilizer space, right? There's regulations. So what role do those policy changes play in the ability to sustainably use animal byproducts?
Well, I think it's very, if I may start here.
Please.
As I mentioned, right, regulations and policies stimulate innovation. That's the only way companies and the commercial world can respond to them. Not fighting them, because that is useless, but adopting them and try to create better technologies is for me the only way forward.
Yeah, I'd say that's right. And if we compare the Europe versus US as an example, you know, I think there's a lot the US can learn from Europe for lots of different things. We just talked about that earlier this morning on the banking system. Nothing to do with animal waste. But you know, proper disposal is really important, and encouraging sustainable practices is one thing, but actually making regulation for proper disposal of anything would go a long way, right? And so that forces people to behave, quite frankly. That's number one. Number two, incentives, unfortunately, are sometimes the necessary evil, in my opinion, from the role of government to implement more green, more circular economy practices. So quite frankly, I think European, Asian, and American regulators should offer incentives for producers specifically, because it always goes back down to the producer, to implement these practices, help them get started on the journey, and help them realize that there's actually a profitable way of doing this, and it's not just an expense on the balance sheet. And that's a solution that we're able to bring today as behalf of ADAR, which we're very proud that we're the only solution we know to date that works so efficiently in this specific space, which obviously we're very proud of and humbled by. I'd say we need more research and development grants to enable more innovation in the space and make them easily accessible by smaller startups. You know, the grant space is a whole career in and of itself. We talk about this as a team. So make them easily accessible. You don't have to have $1 billion. Make them $100,000 or $500,000 state level grants. That would be very helpful, right?
Well, that's a good point then, because most innovation comes from small companies, not from the large ones.
Absolutely, yeah. And like education and awareness, like the USDA in America, or the EPA, you know, create additional awareness campaigns of the overall net impact of consumer behavior and producer behavior of throwing this into the landfill, and create awareness of what other solutions are available today. And quite frankly, if consumers start demanding that the origination of their food and their resources that they're consuming are handled differently, producers make a change, because at the end of the day, consumer behavior changes at the grocery store. So that's what I would say is kind of my key points.
All right, guys, we are out of time. Thank you, Dan, Doug, and Arie, for another very interesting discussion. If you left a comment or a question on our post at the bottom, know that our team will be responding to those as soon as we wrap up. As always, if you have questions, you can reach out to ADAR directly. Just email us at info@adartech.com. And if you have not yet subscribed to our company newsletter for all things ADAR related, be sure to visit our website and click join the shit list. And we will put you on our newsletter list, where you can find out all sorts of updates and find out details about upcoming episodes of ADAR Unveiled and all things ADAR related. Again, thank you guys so much for joining, and we will be back in a few weeks with another episode. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chrissy.